Hey guys, let's talk a little bit about including quotations. So, in a previous lecture, when we talked about how to create a summary, part of creating a summary is including direct quotations. But how do we know when to include a quote and when to just use our own words? So, first and foremost, when creating a summary, you want to use direct quotations sparingly, okay? Too many quotes can take away from your own voice, and you want the majority of your paper, no matter what paper, not just for this essay about summaries, but you want your paper to always be made up mostly of your voice. And so when we start to incorporate too many quotes, the ratio between quotation and your own voice, your own words, starts to skew a little bit, okay? So the only way, or the only reason you should include a direct quotation is if the author's exact wording is needed, okay? So if the author's exact wording isn't needed, then paraphrasing or summarizing is just fine. But if the author's exact wording or exact language is important, that's when you want to include a direct quotation, okay? So how do we know when it's important? These are two rules that you can follow. You want to include a quotation if the author is introducing a term that they specifically coined, or if the way they're saying something is particularly unique or powerful. Going back to coined terms, so if the author has created a specific word or phrase that supports your argument, or if they are introducing specific terminology that most people aren't familiar with, then you're going to want to include a direct quotation, okay? So again, if what you're discussing is a term, word, phrase that the author specifically coined, then you're going to want to use a direct quotation. Or if you're including terminology that most people are unfamiliar with, then you'd want to include a direct quotation as well. Unique or powerful phrasing. So if the author states something in a unique or interesting way, or if you think that their exact wording is particularly powerful and would persuade your reader, then you want to use a direct quote, right? If you really love how an author said something, like you like their specific wordage or syntax or diction, whatever it may be, right? Use a direct quote. If you think to yourself, oh, they said it better than I could say it, include the quote. If you feel like how they said it is particularly persuasive, include a direct quotation. So, you've decided that you want to include a direct quotation into your essay, into your writing. What do we do? How do we do it? So, quotes should always be prefaced with a signal phrase. What this means is, or what a signal phrase is that it's a few words at either the beginning and or the end of a sentence to let the reader know you're incorporating a quotation, okay? So a sentence should never begin and end with a quote, okay? You need to be using your own words either at the beginning and or the end of a sentence to either transition into the quote or transition out of the quote using your own words. So this is what that looks like. Here are a few examples for you to look at. So first, Brown states that on social media we see a whole lot of hatred. Brown states that on is the signal phrase, right? I'm using my own words to tell the reader that I'm about to transition into a quote, something that somebody else said, right? Next example, chapter 4 asserts that people are hard to hate close up. So chapter 4 asserts that is the signal phrase. That is my own words telling the reader that I'm going into a quote, transitioning into a quote. This last example is a little more complex. So when asked for examples of feeling emotionally unsafe, Brown's research participants revealed that dehumanizing language and behavior causes them to create boundaries between themselves and others. So a lot longer of a signal phrase at the beginning, and there's a signal phrase at the end with the quote kind of sandwiched in between, right? That is okay. You do not have to do it at the beginning and the end. It can be either or. But what's important for you to know is that you need to use your own words to transition into or transition out of the quote. A little bit more about signal phrases. So the first time you use a source, you need to use the author's full name to introduce the quote in the signal phrase. Anytime after that, the second, third, fourth time that you're including a quote, from the same source, you only need to use the author's last name. That's totally fine. Here's an example. Susan Mizrachi, professor and scholar at Boston University, observes that monsters are often inspired by religious books. So everything before the quote is my signal phrase. And because this is the first time I'm using this source in my pretend paper, I am introducing the author using their full name. The second example, let's say, is the fourth time I'm using this source. And instead of saying Susan Mizrachi, all I'm saying is Mizrachi implies that blah, blah, blah. So again, the first time you introduce a source, you need to say the author's full name in your signal phrase. Anytime after that, the author's last name is fine. Here are a list of verbs that are commonly used in signal phrases. This is by no means a comprehensive list of all of the verbs you could use, but these are really common ones and plenty to choose from, okay? Please switch it up, okay? What I see very often in student papers is so-and-so says, so-and-so states, so-and-so claims, so-and-so argues. Those are the ones that I see over and over and over again. Switch it up, please, if for anything, just for my own entertainment, right? It gets dull reading says, states over and over again. There are so many different verbs that you can use to convey what you're trying to say. So keep this list in mind, keep it handy. Maybe take a screenshot of it or whatever, just keep it handy. Notice that all of these verbs are in present tense. I want to remind you that when we are referring to literature, we always use literary present tense, right? So it's not confirmed, it's confirms. It's not implied, it's implies. So just, again, be aware of that. I know we talked about it in a previous lecture, but I just want to remind you because it's extremely important, and I know it doesn't come naturally to people. So be intentional, keep an eye out for this. All right, so you have included a quote in your paper. Now what? What follows is honestly probably more important than including the quote itself. It's you analyzing the quote, right? So when you include a quote, it should always be followed by some kind of analysis to tie it back to what you're arguing, okay? You should never include a quote and then move on to something new. You have to explain to your reader why you've included this quote. Why is this information helpful or prove whatever it is you're arguing in your essay? This is extremely important. Imagine that you are a prosecutor in court and you're trying to convince the jury that Jim Jones committed murder, okay? You're standing in front of them in court and you're saying, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, here is the evidence as to why Jim Jones is guilty of murder, okay? You're not just going to give them the evidence and say, okay, do with it as you will and leave the evidence up for their interpretation. No, you're going to say, here's the evidence and then explain to the jury why this evidence or why this information concludes or supports your analysis that this person committed murder, right? You have to do the same thing in your paper, right? You have to explain why the evidence is helpful to what you're arguing, okay? So, saying this, a paragraph should never end with a quote, okay? When you start a new paragraph, that means you're moving on to something new, whether that's a new main point, a new example for the same main point, whatever it is. But when you start a new paragraph, that means you're starting something new. So a paragraph should never end with a quote because before moving on, you need to analyze the quote. Explain to your reader why you've included this information in your essay, okay? So you introduce the quote using that signal phrase we talked about. You give the quote, and then in the next sentence, you explain why this is good evidence, why you've incorporated the quote. Think of the analogy pie. P-I-E. So the P is the point. This is the point I'm trying to make, the main point, right? I is the illustration. This is the evidence that I'm giving to illustrate this main point, right? And then E is the explanation. You explaining why this illustration supports the point you're trying to make, okay? So pie, you should always follow that. You have your main point, you illustrate, you give some supporting information, right? And then you explain that information. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like. In his famous speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. states, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." This powerful declaration underscores King's vision for a society where equality and justice transcend racial boundaries. His use of dream conveys a hopeful aspiration that challenges the deeply entrenched segregation and discrimination of the time. So, at the beginning, in his famous speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. states, that is the signal phrase. That is us using our words to introduce the quote. Then we have the quote itself, and then following the quote is an explanation of the quote, an analysis, right? This is what the quote means, right? Again, super important. More important than giving the evidence itself is you analyzing it, explaining to your reader why you've included it, why it's helpful, why it's relevant towards what you're arguing. Let's talk about brackets. So brackets are the square parentheses. We've all seen them before, but most people don't know how to correctly use them. So we use brackets in direct quotations to add clarity or provide additional information that was not present in the original text. So in a quote, if you need to explain something or give a little clarification for your reader, you can add a few additional of your words in these brackets. So you're inserting additional information for clarity, such as maybe a name or additional context. Look at this example. So the original quote in the original source that you're quoting in your paper says, "He announced it during the meeting." Out of context, we have no idea what the "it" is. So when we're including this quote in our essay, we might say, "He announced," and then in brackets, "the new policy during the meeting." Me as the reader, when I read this in your essay, the brackets tell me that what's between the brackets is not in the original source. That if I went back and actually read the source you're quoting, the words "the new policy" would not be in there. You added them as the writer of the essay to give me, the reader, a little bit more clarification as to what the quote was talking about, okay? Another reason that we would use brackets is to change the capitalization of a letter to fit the grammatical structure of your sentence. So let's say in its original text, the original source, the quote you're wanting to include says, "It was a great day." But how you want to incorporate it into your essay, it wouldn't make sense for the "I" and "it" to be capitalized. You can change that with a bracket. So maybe in your essay, when you are quoting this source, you would say something, "Harry thought that, quote, it was a great day." Again, grammatically, like in a normal sentence without quotations, let's say you were just summarizing that and pretend to remove the quotation marks. If the "I" was capitalized in "it," it wouldn't be grammatically correct. The quotations don't change that. You still need the sentence to be grammatically correct. So we would remove the capital I, add some brackets, and put a lowercase I in its place to make the sentence or the incorporation of the quote into your sentence grammatically correct. So ellipses, we have all seen ellipses before. They are those 3 dots, the dots, okay? So when we use ellipses, we use them to omit words in the middle of a sentence, okay? So let's say you are incorporating a quote, but you don't necessarily need the entire quote, and you just kind of want to remove maybe a piece right in the middle that isn't relevant to your paper. You can do that. So for example, if the original quote is, "The project was successfully completed regardless of rain or snow due to the hard work of the entire team." Okay, so let's say regardless of rain or snow is not necessary. It's not relevant to what you're talking about in your paper. You can remove it by adding the ellipses. So the modified quote would be, "The project was successfully completed," insert the ellipses, "due to the hard work of the entire team." Notice a couple different things. One, that the ellipses are in brackets. That is still necessary because, like we talked about last slide, we use brackets when we add something into the quote that's not in the original source. So if you didn't have the brackets and I read this, I would assume that the ellipses were in the original text. That if I picked up the original source this quote is from, the ... the ellipses would be in the quote. That's what I would think if the brackets weren't there. But because the brackets are there, I know as the reader that you, as the writer of the essay I'm reading, added that into the quote, okay? Secondly, notice that the message of both quotes are exactly the same, okay? By removing regardless of rain or snow, I did not change the meaning of the sentence. This is super important, and you have to make sure that you're sticking to this, right? We can't use ellipses to remove information to change the meaning of a quote to fit our argument better, right? We don't want to manipulate our reader. We just want to make it easier for them to read, right? And so by removing something from a quote that isn't important or necessary, that gives the reader a little bit less to read. It makes what you're trying to say a little more clear. That's good. But what we don't want to do is remove a chunk from a quote to change the meaning of what the original quote says to make it fit our essay better. You cannot do that. Whenever you use an ellipses, the modified quote still needs to reflect the meaning of the original quote. If that is confusing, write it down on your question log and we can talk about it in class. Another reason we would use ellipses is to connect parts of multiple sentences to create a new sentence. So in the first example, we weren't connecting multiple sentences. We were just removing an irrelevant part from a single sentence, which is great. You can definitely use ellipses for that, but you can also use it to connect parts of multiple sentences to make one sentence. Let's take a look at the second example. So the original quote in the original source says this: "The research was groundbreaking and revolutionary in its scope. It provided new insights into the field, and it is extremely inspiring and insightful." So that's the quote in the original source. You are incorporating that quote into your essay, but you don't need all of that information. You want to take some of it from the first sentence, and you want to also take a little bit from the second sentence. You can do this using the ellipses. So the modified quote that would appear in your paper might sound something like this: "The research was groundbreaking and ... the ellipses in the brackets because you are adding it, extremely inspiring," okay? The research was groundbreaking and extremely inspiring. Again, we use the brackets because you want to indicate to your reader that the ellipses is added by you, not the author of the original quote. And the meaning is exactly the same. The research was groundbreaking and extremely inspiring. That is the same thing that the original quote is saying, just in fewer words in one sentence rather than two. So again, you have to add the brackets to indicate to your reader that you added the ellipses, not the author of the original source. And you have to make sure you're preserving the original meaning of the quote inside the original source. So this next concept is always kind of confusing for students because the language used to explain this all sounds very similar. So if you are confused, I apologize, but you are definitely not alone, and we can talk about this more in class if we need. But there are going to be times when we're writing essays that we have to include a quote within a quote. So what this means is when you're quoting a text that is already quoting a separate text, okay? When this happens, we have to use single quotation marks within the quote to indicate to our reader what part of the sentence was already quoted in the source you're quoting. Again, I know that is a lot of the word quote, and it's kind of confusing. But take a look at these examples. The first one says, "In his famous speech, Martin Luther King Jr. emphasizes the importance of equality by quoting the Declaration of Independence. He declares, 'We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.'" So notice how there are 3 quotation marks surrounding that entire quote. What that means is I am quoting Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. That entire thing is in the speech. We know that because the double quotations are around the entire thing. But we also know that that entire thing that Martin Luther King Jr. Is saying is quoted from another text, which here is the Declaration of Independence. So we add the single quotation mark to indicate that. So when I read this, just by seeing those 3 quotation marks, the single quotation added to the already double the normal quotation mark, I know that this is a quote within a quote. Look at the second example. In her article, Dr. Perry discusses how the CDC believes that the pandemic hindered child development and lowered retention rates. So, we know that the quote from Dr. Perry's article starts with the CDC believes that and ends with and lowered retention rates. We know that because the normal double quotation marks are there. So we know all of that came from Dr. Perry's article. But if you notice, there are single quotation marks around the pandemic hindered child development. That is indicating that the CDC said this, and Dr. Perry is quoting that in her source. And now because we are quoting it within a quote, we add the single quotation mark. So if we were reading the quote, the CDC believes that the pandemic hindered child development and lowered retention rates. In the original source, the pandemic hindered child development would be surrounded by normal quotation marks because it's not a quote within a quote. That is what Dr. Perry is quoting. But because we are quoting something that Dr. Perry is quoting, we have to add those single quotation marks. We add the double quotation marks, the normal ones, around what Dr. Perry said in her article, and then we add the single quotation marks in the middle to indicate the part of this quote that was already being quoted in the original source. Again, I know that's probably confusing. If you are confused, please write some questions down in your question log, and we can talk about it in class. I will also say that this does come up frequently. So I know sometimes students see this and they're like, oh, I'm never going to use a quote within a quote. Like, what are the odds that's going to happen? I promise you, like, you will use this. Whether or not it's in my class, I don't know, probably. But if not in this class, you certainly will use it in a separate class. So while this may seem kind of far-fetched and confusing, it is important to know. So please take the time to absorb this information, commit it to memory so you actually understand what to do, how to use the tools needed to incorporate a quote within a quote into your paper. That is it on incorporating quotes. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll see you next time.